poised young woman boards a luxurious train, seeking answers about a former employer's strange disappearance. But when a railroad inspector suddenly insists on sitting beside her, the questions begin to multiply. What does he know? What's he not telling her? And why does it all seem to lead back to a single, locked compartment? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from, and why you're following this. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the platform of Philadelphia's Broad Street station as Miss Eleanor Ashford adjusted her dove-gray traveling dress and smoothed the delicate lace at her collar. The year was 1897, and the autumn air carried the scent of coal smoke and dying leaves, mingling with the perfume of well-dressed travelers preparing to board the westbound express to Pittsburgh. Eleanor's gloved hands clutched a small leather valise, her only companion for this unexpected journey that had begun with a telegram arriving at her Boston home 3 days prior. The message had been brief, almost cryptic in its brevity. Her former employer, the elderly Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, had vanished from her Pittsburgh estate without explanation, leaving behind only a locked diary and a note bearing Eleanor's name. The household staff had found Eleanor's address among Mrs. Whitmore's private papers, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Green, had taken the liberty of requesting her immediate presence. Eleanor had served as Mrs. Whitmore's companion and secretary for 2 years before returning to Boston to care for her ailing mother, who had passed peacefully 6 months ago. The connection between them had been deep, almost familial, and the news of the disappearance troubled Eleanor more than she cared to admit. She stepped into the first-class carriage with practiced grace, her burgundy traveling hat adorned with a single silk flower that matched the subtle rose undertones in her complexion. At 26 years of age, Eleanor possessed a quiet beauty that drew second glances, not from ostentation, but from the intelligence that sparkled in her hazel eyes and the dignified bearing that spoke of good breeding despite modest circumstances. Her chestnut hair was arranged in the fashionable Gibson girl style, soft waves framing a face that could shift from contemplative seriousness to radiant warmth in an instant. The carriage was appointed in the luxurious style befitting the Pennsylvania Railroad's finest, with velvet upholstered seats in deep burgundy, polished mahogany panels, and brass fixtures that gleamed in the lamplight. Eleanor made her way down the narrow aisle, her skirts rustling softly, until she found her assigned seat by the window. She settled herself with the practiced efficiency of an experienced traveler, arranging her skirts and placing her valise on the seat beside her before turning her attention to the platform outside. The scene was one of organized chaos, porters rushing to load luggage, families embracing in tearful farewells, businessmen consulting pocket watches with impatient expressions. Eleanor found something comforting in the familiar rhythm of departure, the promise of movement and possibility that came with every train journey. She removed her gloves carefully, folding them in her lap, and allowed herself a moment to close her eyes and breathe deeply, preparing herself mentally for whatever awaited in Pittsburgh. "Excuse me, miss, is this seat taken?" The voice was deep and resonant, carrying an authority that made Eleanor's eyes open immediately. She turned from the window to find herself looking up at a man who commanded attention simply by existing in a space. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that filled his impeccably tailored charcoal suit, and a presence that seemed to make the carriage feel suddenly smaller. His face was striking rather than conventionally handsome, with strong angular features, a firm jawline, and eyes of such a penetrating gray blue that Eleanor felt momentarily unsettled by their intensity. That is, Eleanor glanced at her valise, then back at the man, noting the silver badge partially visible beneath his coat. "I had hoped to keep it for my belongings, but if the carriage is full—" "Inspector Daniel Hawthorne, Pennsylvania Railroad Police." He touched the brim of his hat politely, his expression neutral but not unkind. "I'm afraid I must insist, miss. Railroad regulations during an active investigation. All passengers must allow officers access to adjacent seats for observation purposes." Eleanor felt a flutter of concern in her chest. "An investigation? Here on this train? I'm not at liberty to discuss the details." Inspector Hawthorne's tone was professional, but something in his eyes suggested a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair slightly longer than the current fashion dictated, showing a tendency to wave that he'd attempted to control with pomade. A small scar above his left eyebrow suggested a past encounter with danger, and his hands, though gentleman's hands, showed the calluses of someone who knew physical work. Eleanor moved her valise to the floor between her feet, her mind racing with questions she knew better than to voice. An investigation on the very train she'd chosen for her journey to uncover the truth about Mrs. Whitmore's disappearance seemed like more than mere coincidence. She watched as Inspector Hawthorne settled his tall frame into the seat beside her, noting how he positioned himself to observe both the aisle and the window, his posture alert despite the casual crossing of his long legs. The train's whistle shrieked 3 times, and with a lurch and a hiss of steam, the great machine began to move. The platform slid away, the waving figures growing smaller, and Philadelphia's industrial skyline gave way to the scattered buildings of the outskirts. Eleanor turned back to the window, attempting to ignore the presence of the inspector beside her, though his proximity made her acutely aware of the subtle scent of bay rum and tobacco that clung to his coat. "You're traveling alone, miss?" Inspector Hawthorne's question broke the silence that had stretched between them for several minutes. "Ashford. Eleanor Ashford." She kept her gaze fixed on the passing landscape, the neat rows of worker housing giving way to autumn fields. "And yes, I am traveling alone. Is that a crime, Inspector?" "Not a crime, no." There was a hint of something almost like amusement in his voice, but unusual for a young woman of obvious refinement. "Most ladies of your station travel with at least a maid or companion." Eleanor turned to face him directly, her chin lifting slightly in a gesture that those who knew her recognized as stubbornness. "I am a working woman, Inspector Hawthorne. I have been a secretary and companion to several distinguished families in Boston. I assure you I am quite capable of managing a simple train journey without supervision." "Boston." He seemed to file this information away mentally. "You're far from home, then. Business or pleasure in Pittsburgh?" "Neither exactly." Eleanor hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. Something about the inspector's direct gaze made her feel as though he could detect any attempt at deception. "A personal matter. A friend has encountered some difficulty. I've been summoned to assist." Inspector Hawthorne's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight narrowing of his eyes that suggested professional interest. "What sort of difficulty?" "With respect, Inspector, I fail to see how my private affairs concern the railroad police." Eleanor's tone was polite but firm. She had learned in her years of service to the wealthy that maintaining appropriate boundaries was essential, and she saw no reason why those same principles shouldn't apply to an interrogation by a railroad inspector. Perhaps they don't. He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxing by degrees, though his eyes never lost their watchful quality. Or perhaps they do. 3 weeks ago, a woman traveling alone on this very route disappeared between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. She boarded the train, was seen by multiple witnesses in the dining car, retired to her compartment, and was simply gone when we arrived at Union Station. Her belongings remained. Her ticket was unused for the return journey, and despite extensive investigation, we found no trace of her. Eleanor felt the color drain from her face. "Disappeared? How is that possible? Surely someone must have seen something." "You would think so, wouldn't you?" Inspector Hawthorne's voice carried a frustration that seemed deeply personal. But between the dinner service and arrival, during which time she should have been in her private compartment, she vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. The only thing we know for certain is that she purchased a ticket under the name Mrs. Catherine Whitmore. The world seemed to tilt sideways for a moment, and Eleanor gripped the armrest of her seat, her knuckles whitening beneath her pale skin. The coincidence was impossible, and yet here it sat between them like a living thing. Inspector Hawthorne was watching her face with the intensity of a man trained to read every micro-expression, every tell that might indicate guilt or knowledge. "Mrs. Whitmore," Eleanor heard herself say, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "Catherine Whitmore of Pittsburgh? You know her." It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of a man who'd just had a suspicion confirmed. Eleanor nodded slowly, her mind struggling to process this information. "She was my employer for 2 years. I served as her companion and secretary until last year when I returned to Boston. I received a telegram 3 days ago from her household staff, saying she had disappeared from her estate. They found my name in her papers and asked me to come. They said nothing about a train journey or a disappearance weeks ago. This makes no sense at all." Inspector Hawthorne leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his entire focus now directed at Eleanor with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. "Miss Ashford, I'm going to need you to tell me everything you know about Mrs. Whitmore. Her habits, her friends, her enemies if she had any, where she might go, who she might trust. Every detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem. I don't understand. Eleanor's thoughts were spinning, trying to reconcile the careful, methodical woman she'd known with this tale of mysterious disappearance. Mrs. Whitmore was 73 years old, Inspector. She was in excellent health for her age, but she was not the sort of woman to undertake impulsive journeys. She maintained a precise routine, attended her garden club meetings, corresponded with her late husband's business associates about charitable foundations. The idea of her boarding a train to Philadelphia without informing her household staff it's completely out of character. People behave out of character when they're frightened. Inspector Hawthorne's voice had softened slightly, though the professional intensity remained. Or when they're protecting something. Mrs. Whitmore had considerable wealth, didn't she? Her late husband's steel fortune. Yes, but she lived modestly. The estate was maintained more for entertaining visiting dignitaries and business associates than for personal luxury. She gave generously to causes she believed in: education for poor children, support for widows of industrial accidents. She was respected, even beloved in certain circles. Eleanor paused, a memory surfacing. There was one thing, though. In the months before I left her service, she seemed preoccupied. She would spend hours in her late husband's study, going through old business papers. She never discussed it with me, but I would sometimes find her staring at documents with the most troubled expression. The train had picked up speed now, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails creating a hypnotic backdrop to their conversation. Outside the window, the landscape had transformed into rolling hills painted in the golds and crimsons of autumn, farms and small villages passing in a blur of Americana pastoral beauty. Other passengers in the carriage had settled into their journeys, some reading newspapers, others dozing. A few engaged in quiet conversations that created a gentle murmur of background noise. Inspector Hawthorne pulled a small leather notebook from his coat pocket, along with a pencil. I need names, Miss Ashford. Anyone who visited Mrs. Whitmore regularly, anyone she corresponded with, anyone who might have had a grievance against her or her late husband's business interests. Eleanor closed her eyes, calling up memories from her time in the Whitmore household. Her lawyer was Mr. Harrison Blackwell of Blackwell and Associates. He visited monthly to review her accounts and ensure everything was in order. There was her nephew, Charles Whitmore, who would call occasionally, though Mrs. Whitmore always seemed rather cold toward him. She said he reminded her too much of his father, her late husband's younger brother, whom she apparently disliked intensely. Why the dislike? I was never told directly, but I gathered there had been some business dispute years ago. Something about the brother trying to claim a larger share of the steel company profits than he was entitled to. Mr. Whitmore, the elder, had apparently cut ties with his brother completely. Eleanor opened her eyes, finding Inspector Hawthorne writing quickly in his notebook, his handwriting small and precise. Then there was her friend, Lady Victoria Pemberton, an English widow who had settled in Pittsburgh society. They met weekly for tea and seemed quite close. Anyone else? Servants who might have been dismissed? Business associates with grudges? Eleanor shook her head slowly. Mrs. Whitmore was scrupulously fair with her staff. I never witnessed any dismissals during my time there, and the household had been stable for years. As for business associates, she had largely withdrawn from active involvement after her husband's death. She maintained correspondence and attended annual meetings of the various charitable boards she supported, but nothing that would generate the sort of enmity that might lead to. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the darker possibilities that were beginning to take shape in her mind. Inspector Hawthorne seemed to understand, his expression gentling slightly as he looked at her. Miss Ashford, I want you to understand something. I've been with the railroad police for 8 years, and before that, I served as a detective with the Philadelphia Police Department. I've seen many things in that time, but this disappearance troubles me more than most. There was something deliberate about it, something planned. Mrs. Whitmore didn't simply wander off or suffer some medical emergency. She vanished in a way that suggests either sophisticated assistance or desperate necessity. You think she's alive then? Hope flared in Eleanor's chest, bright and painful. I think someone wants us to believe she isn't. Inspector Hawthorne's jaw tightened. The question is why, and whether she went willingly or was taken against her will. The dining car was a marvel of Victorian engineering and aesthetics, all polished mahogany and etched glass, with table lamps that cast warm pools of golden light across white linen tablecloths. Eleanor sat across from Inspector Hawthorne at a small table near the center of the car, acutely aware of the curious glances from other passengers. A young woman dining alone with a gentleman would ordinarily be considered scandalous, but the inspector's official capacity seemed to provide a protective shield of propriety, or at least Eleanor chose to believe so. The waiter, an elderly man with distinguished gray whiskers and the bearing of someone who had served refined society for decades, presented them with menus printed on thick cream cardstock. Eleanor's appetite had fled entirely since learning of Mrs. Whitmore's disappearance from this very train, but Inspector Hawthorne had insisted they maintain appearances while he continued his questioning in a more discreet setting. "The roasted chicken is excellent on this line," Inspector Hawthorne said, his voice carrying the casual tone of ordinary dinner conversation, though his eyes remained alert, cataloging every person who entered or exited the dining car. "Though if you prefer fish, the trout is always fresh." "I find myself without much appetite, Inspector." Eleanor set down her menu, folding her hands in her lap. "Perhaps just tea and some bread. You'll need your strength for what lies ahead in Pittsburgh." His tone was gentle but firm. "Allow me to order for both of us. We have much to discuss, and I've learned that difficult conversations are often easier over a proper meal." Eleanor nodded reluctantly, and Inspector Hawthorne ordered chicken with roasted vegetables for both of them, along with a pot of Earl Grey tea. When the waiter departed, Hawthorne leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a level that wouldn't carry beyond their table. "Tell me about the telegram you received. The exact wording, if you can recall it." Eleanor reached into the small beaded reticule that hung from her wrist and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "I kept it. It seemed important somehow, though I couldn't say why at the time." She handed it across the table, watching as Inspector Hawthorne unfolded it with careful fingers and read the typed message. His brow furrowed as he studied the text. "Mrs. Whitmore disappeared from a state stop. Her papers mention your name. Stop, please come, immediately. Stop, situation urgent. Stop, Mrs. Green, housekeeper." He looked up at Eleanor. "Did you verify this was genuinely from Mrs. Green before making the journey?" "I sent a return telegram to the Whitmore estate, but I received no response. I assumed Mrs. Green was too overwhelmed with the crisis to reply immediately." Eleanor felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. "You think it might not be authentic?" "I think the timing is remarkably convenient." Inspector Hawthorne folded the telegram carefully and slid it into his coat pocket. "Mrs. Whitmore disappears from this train 3 weeks ago. The investigation has reached a frustrating standstill." And then suddenly, a woman who knew her intimately receives an urgent summons to Pittsburgh. "It's either the most fortunate coincidence of my career, or someone wanted to ensure you would be on this particular train." The waiter returned with their tea, and Eleanor waited until he had poured and departed before responding. "But why? What purpose could it possibly serve to lure me onto this train? That's what we need to determine." Inspector Hawthorne added a single spoon of sugar to his tea, stirring slowly. "Miss Ashford, I want you to think very carefully. During your time with Mrs. Whitmore, did she ever mention feeling threatened? Did she express concern about anyone or anything unusual?" Eleanor wrapped her hands around her teacup, drawing comfort from its warmth. The rocking motion of the train and the gentle clinking of china and silver created an oddly intimate atmosphere, despite the presence of other diners around them. She found herself studying Inspector Hawthorne's face as she considered his question, noting details she had missed in their initial encounter. There were fine lines at the corners of his eyes, suggesting someone who smiled more often than his current serious demeanor indicated. A small dimple appeared in his left cheek when he was concentrating, as he was now, waiting for her response with patient attention. "There was an incident, about 2 months before I left her service." Eleanor spoke slowly, choosing her words with care. "A man came to the house demanding to see Mrs. Whitmore. The butler turned him away, but I happened to be near the window and saw him as he left. He stood at the gate for several minutes, staring up at the house. There was something in his expression that troubled me, a sort of desperate intensity. Did Mrs. Whitmore know about this visitor? I mentioned it to her that evening. She seemed disturbed by the news but wouldn't explain why. She simply said that some ghosts from the past refused to stay buried, and that I shouldn't concern myself with matters that didn't involve me." Eleanor paused, remembering the look of genuine fear that had crossed Mrs. Whitmore's usually composed features. She went to her husband's study after that and locked herself in for hours. I heard her moving furniture, as though searching for something. Inspector Hawthorne set down his teacup with deliberate precision. Can you describe this man? He was perhaps 50 years of age, though hardship had aged him. He wore a workman's clothes, but they were clean and well-maintained. He had a limp, favoring his left leg considerably. His face was weathered, lined deeply, with gray hair that needed cutting. But his eyes, Inspector, they held such profound sadness mixed with anger. I've never forgotten them. A former employee of the steel mills, perhaps. Inspector Hawthorne was writing again in his notebook. Someone injured in an industrial accident. It's possible. Mr. Whitmore's company employed thousands over the years. There were accidents, as there are in any industrial concern. Mrs. Whitmore took the welfare of former employees very seriously. She continued her husband's policy of providing small pensions to workers who were injured beyond the ability to work again. Their meal arrived, and Eleanor discovered that Inspector Hawthorne had been correct about her need for sustenance. The chicken was expertly prepared, tender and flavorful, and despite her anxiety, she found herself eating with more appetite than she'd expected. They ate in companionable silence for several minutes, the sounds of the dining car washing over them, the clink of cutlery, the murmur of conversations, the rhythmic swaying of the train car. You cared for her, Inspector Hawthorne said suddenly, his eyes meeting Eleanor's across the table. Mrs. Whitmore, she wasn't simply an employer to you. Eleanor felt unexpected tears prick at her eyes and blinked them away firmly. She was kind to me during a difficult period of my life. My mother was ill, and Mrs. Whitmore not only gave me leave to visit her whenever needed, but she also sent her personal physician to consult on my mother's care. When my mother's condition worsened, Mrs. Whitmore released me from my obligations without hesitation, with a generous severance and a letter of recommendation that she insisted would open doors should I need employment in the future. She looked down at her plate. She treated me as a person of worth, Inspector, not merely as a servant. That is a rare quality in employers. Then we share a common goal. Inspector Hawthorne's voice was warm, almost gentle. I want to find her, Miss Ashford, not simply because it's my duty, but because a woman who inspires such loyalty deserves to be found. And if she's in danger, she deserves to be protected. Eleanor looked up, meeting his gaze fully for the first time since they'd sat down to dinner. In the soft lamplight of the dining car, with the inspector's guard lowered by some small degree, she saw something in his expression that surprised her. There was determination, certainly, and professional dedication, but there was also something more personal. A need to set right something that had gone wrong, to solve a puzzle that had eluded him. You blame yourself, she said softly, for not finding her before now. Inspector Hawthorne's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She disappeared under my watch, on my route. I interviewed every passenger in her carriage, every member of the train staff who was working that night. I searched every inch of this train and found nothing. No clues, no witnesses, no logical explanation. For 3 weeks I've been pursuing dead ends and chasing shadows. He paused, his fingers gripping his fork with more force than necessary. And then you appear, carrying a telegram that may or may not be genuine, with information about Mrs. Whitmore that no one else has provided. So yes, Miss Ashford, I take this personally. Then we shall have to help each other. Eleanor's voice was steady, her decision made. I know Mrs. Whitmore's habits, her connections, her history. You have the authority to investigate and the experience to recognize clues I might miss. Together, we have a far better chance of finding her than either of us would have alone. Inspector Hawthorne studied her face for a long moment, as though weighing her resolve and capabilities. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded slowly. Very well, Miss Ashford. But you must understand, if we're to work together, you'll need to follow my lead in matters of safety. If Mrs. Whitmore was taken against her will, whoever is responsible won't hesitate to harm anyone who gets too close to the truth. I understand the risks. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I'm not some delicate flower who will faint at the first sign of danger, Inspector. I've managed households, negotiated with difficult tradesmen, and dealt with family crises that would make seasoned diplomats weep. I may not have your training, but I'm quite capable of holding my own. A smile tugged at the corner of Inspector Hawthorne's mouth, the first genuine smile Eleanor had seen from him. It transformed his face entirely, softening the harsh lines and making him appear years younger. The dimple in his left cheek deepened. and Eleanor felt an unexpected flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the mystery they were attempting to solve. "I don't doubt your capabilities, Miss Ashford." His voice carried a note of amusement, "though I confess I find your determination somewhat surprising for someone of your, shall we say, refined upbringing. My upbringing taught me that gentility and strength are not mutually exclusive, Inspector." Eleanor raised her teacup in a small gesture that was almost a toast, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought with intelligence rather than force. They finished their meal in a more relaxed atmosphere, the tension between them easing into something that felt almost like partnership. Inspector Hawthorne shared details of his investigation, the timeline of Mrs. Whitmore's disappearance, the few facts he had managed to establish. She had boarded the train in Philadelphia at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, carrying a single small trunk and a carpet bag. She had dined alone in the dining car at 6:30, ordering a light meal of soup and bread. She had spoken briefly with the conductor about the expected arrival time in Pittsburgh, and then she had returned to her private compartment and simply vanished. "The compartment was locked from the inside," Inspector Hawthorne explained, his voice low. The porter heard nothing unusual. The window was closed and latched. Yet when we arrived in Pittsburgh and the porter knocked to inform her of our arrival, there was no response. He used his master key to open the door and found the compartment empty. Her trunk was still there, her carpet bag was gone, and there was no sign of a struggle. Could she have left the compartment earlier and simply hidden somewhere on the train? We searched everywhere, Miss Ashford. Everywhere. Every compartment, every storage space, even the engine and coal car. Unless she managed to jump from a moving train in the dark without being seen, which seems highly unlikely for a woman of her age, she did not leave this train by conventional means. Eleanor set down her fork, her appetite deserting her once more. "Then how, Inspector? How does a 73-year-old woman vanish from a locked compartment on a moving train? That's the question that's been keeping me awake at night." Inspector Hawthorne signaled for the waiter to clear their plates. "And I suspect the answer lies not in how she vanished, but in why she needed to vanish in the first place." They returned to their seats in the passenger carriage as twilight deepened into full darkness outside the windows. The landscape that had been so vivid in afternoon sunlight was now reduced to occasional lights from distant farmhouses and the reflection of the train's own lamps on the glass. Other passengers had begun to settle for the night, some dozing in their seats, others reading by the flickering lamplight. Inspector Hawthorne excused himself briefly, saying he needed to check in with the conductor, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts. She stared out the window at her own reflection ghosted against the darkness, seeing not herself but Mrs. Whitmore's kind face, hearing her gentle voice advising Eleanor on everything from proper correspondence to navigating the complex social hierarchies of wealthy households. "Always remember, my dear Eleanor," Mrs. Whitmore had once told her, "that true character reveals itself not in times of comfort, but in moments of crisis. The measure of a person is what they do when no one is watching and nothing is to be gained." Eleanor wondered what crisis had driven Mrs. Whitmore to board this train 3 weeks ago, what secret she had been keeping, what danger she had been fleeing or perhaps confronting. And she wondered, with growing certainty, whether the telegram summoning her to Pittsburgh had indeed been sent by Mrs. Green, or whether some other hand had crafted that message, drawing her into a web she was only beginning to perceive. Inspector Hawthorne returned after nearly 30 minutes, his expression troubled. He settled into the seat beside Eleanor and spoke quietly. "I've just received a telegram from Pittsburgh. Mrs. Green, the housekeeper at the Whitmore estate, died 2 days ago. Heart failure, according to the physician who attended her." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "Then who sent me the telegram?" "Exactly the question I've been asking myself." Inspector Hawthorne's voice was grim. "Someone wanted you on this train, Miss Ashford. Someone who knew enough about Mrs. Whitmore's household to use Mrs. Green's name convincingly. Someone who knew you would respond to a summons from the Whitmore estate. This is madness." Eleanor's hands were trembling, and she clasped them together tightly in her lap. "What could anyone possibly want with me? I'm nobody, Inspector. I have no money, no influence, no information of value. You have something someone wants very badly." Inspector Hawthorne turned in his seat to face her fully, his expression intense. "Knowledge. Memories. Access to Mrs. Whitmore's private world that no one else possesses. You said she spent hours in her husband's study going through old papers. You said she seemed troubled. Whatever she discovered in those papers, whatever secret she was protecting, Someone believes you might know what it is. But I don't know anything. Eleanor's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby passengers, and she forced herself to lower it again. She never confided in me about whatever was troubling her. Are you certain? Think carefully, Miss Ashford. Sometimes we know things without realizing their significance. Inspector Hawthorne leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. A comment she made, a name she mentioned, a document you might have seen in passing, any detail, no matter how small. Eleanor closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe slowly and think. She mentally walked through the Whitmore mansion, room by room, remembering her duties, her conversations with Mrs. Whitmore, the routine of their days together. And then, like a key turning in a lock, a memory surfaced. There was a letter, Eleanor said suddenly, her eyes flying open to meet Inspector Hawthorne's intense gaze. About a week before I left Mrs. Whitmore's service, I was organizing her correspondence when a letter fell from between the pages of her account book. It was old, the paper yellowed with age, and the ink had faded to brown. I only glimpsed it for a moment before Mrs. Whitmore took it from my hands, but I remember certain words because they seemed so out of place. Inspector Hawthorne had pulled out his notebook again, pencil poised. What words, Miss Ashford? Try to remember exactly. Eleanor pressed her fingers to her temples, willing the memory to sharpen. The letter was addressed to Mr. Jonathan Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore's late husband. I saw the words, blood money, and the accident of 1879, and something about conscience demands restitution. Mrs. Whitmore's hands were shaking when she took it from me. She said it was nothing, just old business that had been settled long ago, but her face was pale, Inspector. She looked genuinely frightened. 1879. Inspector Hawthorne was writing rapidly. That was the year of the great furnace explosion at the Whitmore Steelworks. 12 men died, if I recall correctly. It was one of the worst industrial disasters in Pittsburgh's history. I remember hearing about it, Eleanor said slowly. The company paid compensation to the families, and new safety measures were implemented. It was considered a tragic accident, nothing more. What if it wasn't an accident? Inspector Hawthorne's voice was quiet but carried an edge of excitement. What if someone knew the truth about what happened that day, and they were demanding payment for their silence? Blood money, Miss Ashford. That's what blackmailers call their fees. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of the carriage. You think Mr. Whitmore was being blackmailed, but he's been dead for 5 years. Why would this matter now? Perhaps the blackmailer returned, this time approaching Mrs. Whitmore. Inspector Hawthorne's mind was clearly racing through possibilities. The man you saw at the gate, the one with the limp. What if he was one of the survivors of that explosion? What if he knew something about what really caused it, and he came seeking payment or justice after all these years? But why would Mrs. Whitmore flee? Why not simply pay him or go to the authorities? Inspector Hawthorne shook his head. That depends on what the truth was, and how much it would cost her if it came to light. Reputation, Miss Ashford, is currency in society. If the Whitmore fortune was built on concealed negligence or worse, deliberate cost-cutting that led to those deaths, the scandal could destroy everything. The charitable foundations, the family name, the business relationships that still benefit from the Whitmore legacy. The train swayed around a curve, and Eleanor gripped the armrest to steady herself. Outside the window she could see the distant glow of a town, lights scattered like fallen stars across the dark landscape. They were getting closer to Pittsburgh with every passing mile, closer to whatever trap had been set for her, closer to answers that she was no longer certain she wanted to find. Inspector Hawthorne, Eleanor said carefully, if your theory is correct, then Mrs. Whitmore didn't disappear. She ran. She discovered something in those papers that frightened her badly enough that she felt she had no choice but to vanish. And whoever sent you that telegram either wants to use you to find her, or wants to ensure you share whatever knowledge you might possess about what she discovered. Inspector Hawthorne's expression was grim, which means we need to be extremely careful when we arrive in Pittsburgh. We don't know who we can trust. What do you suggest we do? First, we need to get you somewhere safe. I have a colleague in Pittsburgh, Detective Marcus Reynolds. He's with the city police and has been assisting with the investigation. We can trust him. Inspector Hawthorne glanced at his pocket watch. We'll arrive in approximately 2 hours. I'll wire ahead and have Reynolds meet us at the station. Then we need to get to the Whitmore estate and search Mr. Whitmore's study. If there are documents that reveal what happened in 1879, they'll be there. Eleanor nodded, trying to calm the nervous flutter in her stomach. And what about Mrs. Whitmore? If she's hiding somewhere, she must be terrified and alone. If she's hiding, she chose to do so for a reason. Inspector Hawthorne's voice was gentle but firm. But I don't believe she's hiding anymore, Miss Ashford. I think someone found her. And I think that someone is now very interested in making certain no one else discovers what she knew. The implications of his words hung heavy between them. Eleanor turned back to the window, unable to meet his eyes, unable to voice the fear that was growing in her heart. Mrs. Whitmore, who had been so kind to her, who had treated her with dignity and respect, might already be beyond help. The thought was almost unbearable. Don't give up hope yet. Inspector Hawthorne's hand moved as though he might reach out to touch her shoulder in comfort, then stopped, remembering propriety. I've learned in my years as an investigator that the truth has a way of revealing itself if you're patient and observant. We're closer now than we've been in 3 weeks. That telegram, false though its origins may be, has given us a thread to follow. Eleanor turned to look at him, seeing past the stern inspector's exterior to the man beneath. There was compassion in his eyes, and a determination that matched her own. You really do care about finding her, don't you? This isn't just another case to you. No, he admitted quietly. It isn't. My mother died when I was 14 years old, Miss Ashford. She was traveling alone on a train, going to visit her sister in Baltimore. There was an accident, a derailment, and she was killed. For years I wondered if things might have been different if someone had been there to help her, to protect her. He paused, his gaze distant. I became a railroad detective because I wanted to ensure that people traveling alone, especially women, would be safe. Every case I handle, I think of my mother. And this case, with Mrs. Whitmore vanishing without explanation, without anyone to protect her or even know what happened, it haunts me. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the close atmosphere of the carriage and everything to do with the man beside her. She had thought him cold and professional, but beneath that exterior was someone who understood loss, who carried his own grief and used it to fuel his determination to help others. I'm sorry about your mother, she said softly. That must have been terribly difficult. It taught me that life is fragile, and that we must protect those who cannot protect themselves. Inspector Hawthorne met her gaze, and Eleanor saw vulnerability there that she suspected few people were privileged to witness. It also taught me that sometimes the most important thing we can do is refuse to give up, even when all evidence suggests we should. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, the rhythm of the train creating a soothing backdrop to Eleanor's racing thoughts. She found herself acutely aware of Inspector Hawthorne's presence beside her, the subtle warmth that seemed to emanate from him, the way his shoulder was close enough to hers that she could feel the movement of his breathing. It was improper, she knew, to feel such awareness of a gentleman she had known for mere hours, but there was something about shared purpose and shared danger that created intimacy more quickly than months of conventional courtship. Tell me about Boston, Inspector Hawthorne said suddenly, breaking the silence. What was your life like there after you left Mrs. Whitmore's service? Eleanor was surprised by the personal question, but found herself answering readily. Quiet, lonely, if I'm honest. I took a position as a governess for a merchant family, teaching their 3 daughters music and French. They were sweet children, but the parents were distant, focused entirely on social advancement. It wasn't the same as working for Mrs. Whitmore, who valued learning and conversation for their own sake, rather than as tools for climbing society's ladder. No gentlemen callers? There was a note of curiosity in his voice that made Eleanor's cheeks warm. A few, she admitted. My employer's business associate, Mr. Thornton, expressed interest. He was respectable enough, financially secure, appropriate by all conventional measures. But there was no spark, Inspector. No real connection beyond polite conversation and shared social circles. When he proposed, I declined as gracefully as I could manage. He proposed, and you refused him? Inspector Hawthorne sounded genuinely surprised. That took considerable courage, Miss Ashford. Most women in your position would have accepted the security such a match offered. Most women are not as stubborn as I am, Eleanor said with a slight smile. My mother used to despair of my romantic notions. She said I was too particular, that I would end up alone if I insisted on waiting for some impossible ideal of true affection and mutual respect. Her smile faded. Perhaps she was right, but I couldn't bear the thought of spending my life with someone I merely tolerated, pretending to feelings I didn't possess. Your mother was wrong. Inspector Hawthorne's voice was firm. Settling for less than genuine affection leads to a lifetime of regret. You were right to wait for something real, even if it means waiting longer than others might. Eleanor turned to look at him, surprised by the conviction in his tone. You sound as though you speak from experience, Inspector. I do. He met her gaze steadily. I was engaged once, 5 years ago. She was beautiful, accomplished, everything a man was supposed to want in a wife. But she couldn't understand my work. Couldn't accept that I might miss dinners or social events because of an investigation. She wanted me to resign from the police department and take a position in her father's banking firm, to become the sort of gentleman who attends parties and discusses stock prices rather than pursuing criminals. He paused. I realized that she didn't love me as I was. She loved the version of me she hoped to create. So I ended the engagement. That must have been difficult. It was the right decision. Inspector Hawthorne's expression softened slightly. Better a moment of pain than a lifetime of pretending to be someone I'm not. Since then, I've focused on my work, on becoming the best investigator I can be. I haven't had time for courtship or romance. Haven't had time, or haven't met anyone who made you want to make time? Eleanor asked, then immediately felt her cheeks flush at her own boldness. Forgive me. That was inappropriate. No, it was perceptive. Inspector Hawthorne smiled, that same transformative smile that made him appear years younger. The truth is both, I suppose. My work is demanding, but I also haven't met anyone who made me want to rearrange my priorities. Until... He stopped abruptly, as though realizing he had been about to say something he shouldn't. Eleanor's heart was beating faster, though she told herself firmly that this was merely the stress of their situation, the heightened emotions brought on by danger and mystery. It couldn't possibly be anything more profound, not based on mere hours of acquaintance. The train's whistle blew 3 long blasts, signaling their approach to a station. Inspector Hawthorne pulled out his pocket watch and checked the time. Harrisburg. We'll stop here for about 15 minutes while they take on water and coal. Would you like to step out onto the platform for some fresh air? Eleanor nodded gratefully, suddenly feeling the need to escape the close confines of the carriage and the even closer proximity to Inspector Hawthorne that was doing strange things to her composure. They made their way through the carriage to the exit, Inspector Hawthorne's hand at her elbow to steady her as the train lurched to a stop. The platform at Harrisburg was well lit with gas lamps, and the cool evening air was refreshing after hours in the heated carriage. Eleanor breathed deeply, trying to clear her head and organize her tumultuous thoughts. Inspector Hawthorne stood beside her, his tall frame providing a sense of security that Eleanor found unexpectedly comforting. Miss Ashford, he said quietly, his eyes scanning the platform and the other passengers who had disembarked for the brief stop. I want you to promise me something. When we reach Pittsburgh, you'll stay close to me. Don't trust anyone, no matter how friendly or helpful they seem, until we know who sent that telegram and what they want from you. I promise, Eleanor said, meaning it absolutely. Whatever was waiting for them in Pittsburgh, she knew instinctively that her best chance of survival and of finding Mrs. Whitmore lay in trusting this man who had appeared in her life so unexpectedly. A porter walked past carrying luggage, and Eleanor caught sight of a familiar carpet bag among the items. It was distinctive, made of tapestry fabric with a pattern of roses that Mrs. Whitmore had once described to her. Eleanor's hand shot out, gripping Inspector Hawthorne's arm. That bag, she said urgently. The tapestry one with roses. Mrs. Whitmore had one exactly like it. She said it was custom made by a shop in Philadelphia, that there were only 3 made in that pattern. Inspector Hawthorne's entire demeanor changed in an instant, his casual alertness transforming into focused intensity. Which porter? Show me. Eleanor pointed to the man who was loading bags onto a luggage cart. Inspector Hawthorne strode toward him, with Eleanor following quickly. Excuse me, that carpet bag with the rose pattern. Where did it come from? The porter looked up, his weathered face confused. This one, sir. It was left in the baggage car. Found it this morning when I was cleaning out the storage area. No claim ticket, no identification. I was taking it to the lost and found. I need to examine it. Inspector Hawthorne's voice carried absolute authority. Railroad police business. The porter handed over the bag without argument, and Inspector Hawthorne carried it to a bench under one of the gas lamps. Eleanor watched as he carefully opened the clasp and began examining the contents. There were several items of clothing, neatly folded, a pair of ladies' gloves, a small leather journal, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a silk handkerchief, a stack of letters tied with a black ribbon. Inspector Hawthorne carefully extracted the journal and opened it to the first page. Eleanor leaned closer, reading over his shoulder. The handwriting was unmistakably Mrs. Whitmore's, elegant and precise. "If anyone finds this journal," the first entry read, "know that I did not leave willingly, but I left because I had no choice. The truth about what happened at the steelworks in 1879 must not die with me. Jonathan tried to hide it, tried to bury it with money and silence, but blood cries out for justice, even after 18 years. I am going to Philadelphia to meet with the one man who can corroborate my testimony, the one survivor who knows the whole truth. His name is Thomas Brennan, and he has been waiting all these years for someone to finally listen. If I do not return, let this journal and the letters I carry serve as evidence. The explosion was not an accident. It was the result of deliberate negligence, of choosing profit over safety, of ignoring warnings that could have saved 12 lives. I will not let their deaths be meaningless. Catherine Whitmore, October 3, 1897. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Whitmore had gone to Philadelphia seeking justice, seeking to right a wrong that had haunted her for years. And somehow, that quest had led to her disappearance. Inspector Hawthorne carefully tucked the journal into his coat and rewrapped the letters in the silk handkerchief. His expression was a mixture of triumph and concern as he looked at Eleanor. This changes everything. We now have evidence, Miss Ashford. Real, tangible evidence of what Mrs. Whitmore discovered and why she made that journey to Philadelphia. But where is she? Eleanor's voice broke slightly. The journal says she went to meet Thomas Brennan. Did she meet him? What happened after that? We're going to find out. Inspector Hawthorne's jaw was set with determination. But first, we need to get back on the train and reach Pittsburgh safely. Whoever is behind this will know by now that we've found the carpetbag. They'll be watching, waiting for us. They returned to their carriage as the train's whistle signaled imminent departure. Eleanor's mind was racing with the implications of what they had discovered. Mrs. Whitmore had uncovered evidence that her late husband had been complicit in the deaths of 12 men, that he had chosen profit over safety. The weight of such knowledge, the conflict between loyalty to her husband's memory and the demands of justice, must have been overwhelming. As the train pulled out of Harrisburg Station, Eleanor noticed a man in a dark overcoat standing at the far end of their carriage. He had boarded during the stop, and something about the way he was watching them made her uneasy. She touched Inspector Hawthorne's arm and nodded discreetly in the man's direction. Inspector Hawthorne's eyes flickered toward the stranger, and Eleanor saw his hand move subtly to rest near his coat, where she suspected he carried a weapon. "Stay calm," he murmured. "Act as though you've noticed nothing unusual." The man began walking down the aisle toward them, his gait steady despite the swaying of the train. As he drew closer, Eleanor could see his face more clearly. He was perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair graying at the temples and sharp features that might have been handsome if not for the hardness in his eyes. He stopped beside their seats and touched the brim of his hat. "Inspector Hawthorne, I presume?" His voice was cultured, educated, with a slight accent that Eleanor couldn't quite place. "And Miss Eleanor Ashford. How fortunate to find you both together. You have the advantage of me, sir." Inspector Hawthorne's tone was polite but cold. "You know our names, but you haven't provided your own." "How remiss of me. I am Mr. James Ashton, legal counsel for the Whitmore Steel Company." He smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "I've been trying to locate Miss Ashford for several days now. When I learned she had boarded this train, I took the liberty of following." "Legal counsel?" Eleanor found her voice, though her heart was pounding. "Mrs. Whitmore never mentioned you." "I represent the company interests, Miss Ashford, not Mrs. Whitmore personally. There is a distinction." Mr. Ashton's gaze moved to Inspector Hawthorne's coat, where the journal was hidden. "I understand you've recently come into possession of certain documents. I'm here to inform you that those documents are the property of the Whitmore estate and must be surrendered immediately. The documents are evidence in an ongoing investigation," Inspector Hawthorne said firmly. "They're not going anywhere except into official custody. I think you'll find that the situation is more complicated than that, Inspector." Mr. Ashton's smile turned predatory. "The Whitmore Steel Company employs over 3,000 men. If certain allegations contained in those documents were to become public, The scandal would destroy the company. Those 3,000 men and their families would be thrown into poverty. Is that the justice you seek? To punish the innocent for the sins of the dead? Eleanor felt a chill run through her. The argument was cleverly constructed, designed to appeal to their sense of mercy and social responsibility. But there was something fundamentally wrong about it, something that made her want to reject it entirely. The men who died in that explosion had families too, she said, her voice steady despite her fear. They deserved justice then, and they deserve it now. You can't bury the truth simply because it's inconvenient. Idealistic words from someone who has never known real poverty, Miss Ashford. Mr. Ashton's tone was condescending. Mrs. Whitmore made the same mistake. She thought justice was simple, that the truth could be revealed without consequences. She learned otherwise. What have you done with her? Inspector Hawthorne was on his feet now, his considerable height and presence making Mr. Ashton step back slightly. Where is Mrs. Whitmore? I have done nothing with her, Inspector. I'm merely a lawyer trying to protect my client's interests. Mr. Ashton's composure had slipped slightly, revealing nervousness beneath the polished exterior. But I will tell you this. Mrs. Whitmore met with Thomas Brennan in Philadelphia, as she intended. Mr. Brennan, however, is not the reliable witness she believed him to be. Years of drinking and bitterness have made him unstable. When Mrs. Whitmore realized that his testimony would never hold up in court, that pursuing this crusade would destroy the company for nothing, she agreed to a compromise. What kind of compromise? Eleanor demanded. She agreed to abandon her quest for public exposure in exchange for the company establishing a substantial fund for the families of industrial accident victims, anonymous donations, generous support, real help for those in need. Justice without scandal, Miss Ashford. That's what she chose. Mr. Ashton's voice became almost pleading. She's perfectly safe, living quietly under an assumed name in a comfortable cottage in the countryside. She simply wanted to escape the burden of the Whitmore name and all its complications. Inspector Hawthorne's expression was skeptical. If that's true, then produce her. Let us speak with her directly. I'm afraid that's not possible. Mrs. Whitmore was quite specific in her wishes for privacy. She doesn't want to be found, Inspector, by anyone. Mr. Ashton reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. This is a letter, written in her own hand, explaining her decision and requesting that no one attempt to locate her. I'm authorized to show it to you. Eleanor took the letter with trembling fingers and unfolded it. The handwriting did appear to be Mrs. Whitmore's, and the content matched what Mr. Ashton had described. But something about it felt wrong. The phrasing was too formal, too careful, lacking the warmth and personality that had always characterized Mrs. Whitmore's correspondence. This could have been written under duress, she said, handing the letter to Inspector Hawthorne. Or it could be a forgery. I've seen Mrs. Whitmore's handwriting hundreds of times, and while this resembles it, there are subtle differences. The way she forms her letter E is slightly off, and she always signed her name with a particular flourish that's missing here. Inspector Hawthorne examined the letter closely, then fixed Mr. Ashton with a hard stare. I think you're lying. I think Mrs. Whitmore discovered something that threatened powerful interests, and I think you're part of the effort to silence her. The question is whether you're doing this for money or because you believe you're protecting something larger. Mr. Ashton's facade cracked entirely. You don't understand what's at stake here. The truth about 1879 goes deeper than a single accident. Jonathan Whitmore wasn't the only one involved in the decision to cut corners on safety. There were board members, investors, men who are still alive and still powerful. If this comes out, it won't just destroy the company. It will bring down some of the most prominent families in Pittsburgh society. Including yours? Eleanor asked quietly. Mr. Ashton's face went pale. My father was on that board. He voted with Jonathan Whitmore to proceed with the expansion despite the engineer's warnings about the furnace. When the explosion happened, my father spent the rest of his life drowning in guilt. He died 2 years ago, and I thought the secret had died with him. But then Mrs. Whitmore started digging into old records, started asking questions. I couldn't let her destroy my family's name, couldn't let my mother and sisters bear the shame of what my father had done. So you took her. Inspector Hawthorne's voice was ice cold. Where is she, Ashton? Tell me now, or I'll have you arrested for kidnapping. I didn't kidnap her. Mr. Ashton's voice rose in desperation. I swear to you, I only spoke with her, tried to convince her to keep silent. When she refused, I left. But there were others on that train, others who had more to lose than I did. Charles Whitmore, her nephew, stood to inherit the estate. If the scandal broke, if the company was sued by the victims' families, there would be nothing left to inherit. He was desperate, Inspector, more desperate than I was. Eleanor felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her. Charles Whitmore, the nephew Mrs. Whitmore had always treated with such coldness, had been on the train the night of her disappearance. And if Mr. Ashton was telling the truth, Charles had the strongest motive of all to ensure his aunt never revealed what she knew. "Where is Charles Whitmore now?" Inspector Hawthorne demanded. "In Pittsburgh, at the estate. He's been living there since Mrs. Whitmore disappeared, claiming he's managing her affairs in her absence." Mr. Ashton's shoulders slumped in defeat. "I swear to you I don't know what he did with her. But when I saw her carpetbag in the baggage car the next morning, when I realized she had simply vanished, I knew something terrible had happened. I've been trying to find evidence, trying to figure out what Charles did, but he's clever. He's covered his tracks well." Inspector Hawthorne pulled a pair of handcuffs from his coat. "James Ashton, you're under arrest for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. You'll be held in the baggage car under guard until we reach Pittsburgh, at which point you'll be turned over to the city police." Mr. Ashton didn't resist as Inspector Hawthorne secured the handcuffs. "I deserve this," he said quietly. "I should have gone to the police immediately when I suspected Charles. Instead, I tried to protect myself, to keep my family's name clean. I'm as guilty as my father was of choosing self-interest over justice." Inspector Hawthorne called for the conductor and arranged for Mr. Ashton to be confined under guard. When they were alone again, Eleanor found herself trembling with reaction to everything they had learned. Inspector Hawthorne guided her gently back to her seat and sat beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "We're close now," he said softly. "Charles Whitmore doesn't know we have the journal and letters. He doesn't know we've connected him to the disappearance. When we arrive in Pittsburgh, we'll have Detective Reynolds arrest him, and we'll search the estate from top to bottom. If Mrs. Whitmore is alive, we'll find her. And if she's not," Eleanor couldn't bring herself to complete the thought, "then we'll ensure that her death wasn't in vain." Inspector Hawthorne's voice was firm. "The truth will come out, Miss Ashford. The men who died in that explosion will have justice at last. I promise you that." The train was approaching Pittsburgh now, the scattered lights of outlying settlements growing denser, coalescing into the glow of the city. Eleanor could see the reflection of blast furnaces painting the night sky orange, the industrial heart of America beating strong beneath the darkness. Somewhere in that city was the answer to Mrs. Whitmore's disappearance, and Eleanor was determined to find it, no matter what the cost. Inspector Hawthorne sent a telegram from the next station stop, alerting Detective Reynolds to meet them with a full complement of officers prepared to arrest Charles Whitmore and search the Whitmore estate. As the train made its final approach to Union Station, Eleanor felt Inspector Hawthorne's hand cover hers, where it rested on the armrest between them. "Whatever we find tonight," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I'm grateful to have met you, Eleanor. Your courage and determination have been remarkable. Mrs. Whitmore was fortunate to have earned such loyalty." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, at the use of her given name, at the gentle pressure of his hand on hers. "I'm grateful too, Daniel," she said, daring to use his first name in return, "for your dedication to finding the truth, for your protection, for your partnership in this investigation. I couldn't have done this alone." Their eyes met and held, and Eleanor felt something shift between them, something that went beyond shared purpose or professional respect. In the space of a single train journey, they had formed a connection that felt deeper and more real than anything Eleanor had experienced in her carefully proper courtships. Perhaps it was the intensity of their shared mission, or perhaps it was simply that they had recognized in each other qualities that resonated at a fundamental level: integrity, determination, compassion, and an unwillingness to accept injustice. The train pulled into Union Station with a final screech of brakes and a cloud of steam. Inspector Hawthorne stood and offered Eleanor his hand, helping her to her feet. Together they made their way to the platform, where Detective Reynolds was waiting with half a dozen uniformed officers. "We've surrounded the Whitmore estate," Reynolds reported, a stocky man with keen eyes and a competent manner. "Charles Whitmore is inside. We've been watching the house for the past hour, and he hasn't attempted to leave." "Good. Let's move quickly before he has a chance to destroy evidence or make a run for it." Inspector Hawthorne kept Eleanor close to his side as they climbed into the police carriage that would take them to the estate. The Whitmore mansion rose before them like a monument to industrial wealth. 3 stories of stone and brick with elaborate Victorian detailing. Every window blazed with light, as though Charles Whitmore had lit the entire house in defiance of the darkness closing in around him. The police officers moved into position, surrounding the building, while Inspector Hawthorne, Detective Reynolds, and Eleanor approached the front entrance. The butler who answered the door looked frightened, his composure cracking when he saw the police. "Mr. Charles is in the study," he said without being asked. "He's been in there for hours, drinking and talking to himself. I think he knows you're coming." They found Charles Whitmore exactly where the butler had indicated, sitting behind his uncle's massive mahogany desk with a half-empty bottle of whiskey at his elbow. He was younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps 35, with the handsome features and expensive clothing of a man born to privilege, but his eyes were red-rimmed and desperate, and his hands shook as he poured himself another drink. "I knew this day would come," he said, not looking up as they entered. "I told myself I could live with it, that the money was worth the guilt, but it turns out I'm not as strong as I thought I was." "Where is Mrs. Whitmore?" Inspector Hawthorne's voice was hard as iron. "Tell us now, and it will go better for you." Charles Whitmore laughed, a bitter sound without humor. "Better? Inspector, there is no better for me. I killed her. I pushed my own aunt from a moving train because I couldn't bear the thought of losing my inheritance. What mercy do I deserve?" Eleanor felt her knees buckle, and Inspector Hawthorne's arm came around her waist, supporting her. "Pushed her where?" he demanded. "From which part of the train?" "The observation platform at the rear of her carriage. It was dark. We were crossing a bridge over the Allegheny River. I told her I wanted to speak with her privately, asked her to step outside for fresh air. When we were alone, I grabbed her and pushed. She fell into the water below." Charles finally looked up, his face a mask of self-loathing. "I told myself she died quickly, that she didn't suffer. But I hear her voice every night calling out to me. I can't sleep, can't eat, can't think of anything except what I've done." "The Allegheny River Bridge," Detective Reynolds said urgently. "There are fishing villages downstream. If she survived the fall, if someone pulled her from the water, it's possible," Inspector Hawthorne said, hope flaring in his voice. "The river wasn't running high 3 weeks ago. If she landed in a shallow section, if someone found her quickly—" He turned to Charles Whitmore. "Did you see her surface? Did you watch to make sure she didn't survive?" "I couldn't watch." Charles's voice was barely a whisper. "I ran back inside immediately, locked myself in the washroom and vomited. I'm a coward as well as a murderer." Inspector Hawthorne was already moving, pulling Eleanor with him. "Reynolds, arrest him and search the house for any additional evidence. Eleanor and I are going to check every village downstream from that bridge. If there's even a chance she survived, we have to find her tonight." They raced through the night in a police carriage, stopping at every settlement along the river, showing Mrs. Whitmore's photograph to anyone they could rouse from sleep. Hours passed, each failure making Eleanor's hope dim a little more. And then, in a small fishing village 10 miles downstream from the bridge, an elderly woman answered their knock and peered at the photograph in the lamplight. I know her," the woman said. "Found her on the riverbank 3 weeks ago, half drowned and barely conscious. She's been recuperating in my spare room. Couldn't remember her name or where she came from, poor dear." The blow to her head stole her memories clean away. Eleanor felt tears of relief streaming down her face as the woman led them inside to a small, neat room where Mrs. Whitmore lay, sleeping peacefully. Her hair was white now instead of gray, and she looked frailer than Eleanor remembered, but she was alive. Wonderfully, miraculously alive. "Mrs. Whitmore," Eleanor whispered, kneeling beside the bed and taking the older woman's hand. "It's Eleanor. I've come to take you home, Mrs." Whitmore's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition, and then joy. "Eleanor? My dear girl, I've been having the strangest dreams. I couldn't quite remember, but I knew someone was coming for me. I knew I just had to wait." Over the following days, as Mrs. Whitmore's memories slowly returned and her strength rebuilt, the full story emerged. The journal and letters provided the evidence needed to reopen the investigation into the 1879 explosion. Charles Whitmore was charged with attempted murder and would face trial. James Ashton cooperated fully with authorities, and while he faced charges for his role in the conspiracy, his testimony helped ensure that justice would finally be served for the 12 men who had died. The Whitmore Steel Company established a substantial compensation fund for the victims' families, and new safety regulations were implemented across the industry. Mrs. Whitmore, once recovered, became an advocate for industrial safety reform, using her position and resources to prevent future tragedies. And Eleanor discovered that her life had changed in ways she never could have anticipated. Inspector Daniel Hawthorne had proven himself to be everything she had hoped to find in a partner: brave, compassionate, intelligent, and possessed of an integrity that matched her own. When he called at her Boston residence 3 months after the resolution of the case, she knew what he would say before he spoke the words. "I've been thinking about what you said on the train," he began, standing in her modest parlor with his hat in his hands. "About not settling, about waiting for something real. Eleanor, I believe I've found something real, and I hope you feel the same. I know we've only known each other a short time, but sometimes the most important things in life happen quickly, when we least expect them." "I feel the same," Eleanor said softly, her heart full of joy and certainty. "I think I knew on that train, when we were working together to find Mrs. Whitmore. You saw me as an equal, as a partner. You valued my intelligence and my insights. You didn't try to protect me from the truth or shield me from danger beyond what was reasonable. You trusted me. I love you, Eleanor Ashford." Daniel's voice was steady, sure. "And I'm asking you to marry me, to be my partner in all things, not just in investigation, but in life. I can't promise you wealth or social position, but I can promise you respect, partnership, and a love that will last the rest of our days." "Yes," Eleanor said simply, moving into his arms. "Yes to all of it. I love you too, Daniel Hawthorne, and I can't imagine a better future than one spent at your side." Their wedding took place 6 months later in a small church in Philadelphia, with Mrs. Whitmore in attendance, fully recovered and radiant with happiness for the young couple whose determination and courage had saved her life. As Eleanor and Daniel exchanged their vows, promising to honor and cherish each other through all the adventures that lay ahead, Eleanor reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. A telegram, a train journey, a mystery that had seemed insurmountable, and through it all, the growing certainty that they were meant to find each other. She had taken her seat by the window in quiet elegance that autumn afternoon, never expecting that the stern inspector who questioned her would become the love of her life. But life, Eleanor had learned, had a way of surprising you when you were brave enough to embrace its mysteries. And as she looked into Daniel's eyes and saw her own joy reflected back at her, she knew that the greatest mystery of all, the mystery of love and connection, and two souls recognizing each other across the chaos of the world, had been solved in the most beautiful way possible. Their life together would be unconventional by society's standards. Eleanor continued to assist Daniel in his investigations, her keen mind and attention to detail proving invaluable in solving cases. They became known as the most effective investigative partnership in the railroad police, and later, when Daniel was promoted to chief detective, their reputation spread throughout the eastern seaboard. But more important than their professional success was the deep, abiding love they shared, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the unshakable certainty that they had found in each other exactly what they had been searching for all along. Mrs. Whitmore often said that her near-death experience had given her an unexpected gift, the joy of seeing Eleanor find true happiness with a man who deserved her. And Eleanor, holding Daniel's hand as they faced each new challenge together, knew that sometimes the most elegant journeys were the ones that began with a simple question from an unexpected stranger and ended with a love that would last forever.